April 1941, North Africa. After crushing triumph came total disaster. British forces had swept across Libya, smashing the Italian army and collecting over 30,000 prisoners. Victory seemed certain. Then Rommel arrived. 11 days. That's all it took for the Afrika Korps to tear through 500 kilometres. British command collapsed. Generals captured and entire divisions dissolved, fleeing east while panzers rolled forward unopposed. By April 10th, only one fortress remained, Tobruk. Holding it, the green untested 9th Australian Division. Surrender was expected, but one man refused to yield. Major-General Leslie Morshead. Stepping up in front of his men, he said, "There will be no Dunkirk here. If we should have to get out, we shall fight our way out. There is to be no surrender and no retreat." This is the story of disaster, defiance, and the Australian commander who turned certainty of defeat into the legend of the Rats of Tobruk. 3 months earlier, the British had achieved what seemed impossible. Operation Compass saw General Richard O'Connor's Western Desert Force destroy 10 Italian divisions with just 2 of his own, prompting Wavell to cable Churchill that the situation is transformed. But London made a fatal miscalculation when Greece began collapsing under German invasion, ordering the best British and Australian units, veteran armour, artillery, entire infantry brigades, redeployed to the Balkans, leaving North Africa with skeleton forces. On February 12, 1941, Rommel arrived in Tripoli with the 5th Light Division under orders from Berlin to hold Tripolitania, await the 15th Panzer Division, and defend only. But Rommel toured the front, saw the British were weak, and decided orders were optional. March 24th brought reconnaissance in force at El Agheila, which prompted a British withdrawal, followed on March 31st by a full offensive that the 2nd Armoured Division, down to 1 understrength brigade, attempted to hold against mechanical breakdowns, Stuka strikes and relentless panzer attacks that cost them over half their tanks by April 3rd. Benghazi was evacuated, Derna abandoned, and General Philip Neame, newly appointed and unfamiliar with the terrain, lost communication with his scattered units before being captured alongside O'Connor on April 6th after taking a wrong turn in the dark. The British command structure collapsed. On April 10th, the Australian 9th Division occupied Tobruk, the same port they had captured from the Italians 12 weeks earlier, but now the Italians were back with panzers. Tobruk's strategic value was absolute as the only deep-water harbour for 400 kilometres, which Rommel needed to supply his drive into Egypt, prompting Churchill to cable Wavell, "Tobruk must be held to the death without thought of retirement." Easier ordered than done. Inside the perimeter were 25,000 men, the 9th Australian Division with the attached 18th Brigade of the 7th Division, British artillery, Indian 18th Cavalry, and Polish Carpathian Brigade detachments, with no armoured reserve, limited ammunition, and the Luftwaffe owning the sky. Wavell considered evacuation but deemed it too risky, leaving the garrison under one commander, Major-General Leslie Morshead. 51 years old, a former schoolmaster from Sydney who had survived Gallipoli in 1915 and the Western Front from 1916 to 1918, particularly Pozieres, where the AIF learned that trenches, proper trenches, obsessively maintained, kept soldiers alive when artillery turned the earth to moonscape. Morshead commanded the 9th Division with the charm of a drill sergeant and the standards of a Swiss watchmaker, earning him the nickname Ming the Merciless from his men, affectionately but tempered with respect. He inspected daily, demanding that wire be strung at regulation tension, trenches dug to exact depth, deep enough to survive artillery, shallow enough to counterattack from, with machine gun arcs interlocking and ammunition stored below ground, rotated and inventoried, and if your fieldcraft failed inspection, you redug until it didn't. Some officers grumbled, but Morshead didn't care because he had fought under incompetent British generals in 1916, watching men die because no one checked the fundamentals, and he would not repeat that. On April 9th, 1941, Morshead gathered his battalion commanders at divisional headquarters for a meeting recorded in multiple war diaries, where he spoke plainly, "There will be no Dunkirk here. If we should have to get out, we shall fight our way out. There is to be no surrender and no retreat." Not rhetoric, but policy. No evacuation plans, no fallback positions, because if Rommel broke through, you counterattacked. If you were surrounded, you held. And if you died in the wire. That clarity, brutal and absolute, changed the psychology of defense because there was no hope of rescue, only the work. And Morshead had a plan. Tobruk's perimeter stretched 40 kilometres of rock and sand where the Italians had left behind 30 concrete strongpoints that were obvious, static, and pre-registered by their own artillery. Easy targets. Morshead tore up the Italian plan and rebuilt from zero. The first layer was an outpost line positioned 2 to 3 kilometres forward of the main perimeter, lightly held with small patrols and two-man observation posts whose purpose was to see the enemy early, slow the advance, and withdraw before getting overrun. The key principle was simple. Don't die for empty desert. Let the armour come and bleed their tempo, not your men. The second layer formed the main defensive belt with double-apron barbed wire staked deep into hardpan, behind which lay anti-tank mines in staggered rows, Italian, British, improvised, mixed with anti-personnel devices until 15,000 mines were in place by mid-April. But here's the genius. Morshead left deliberate gaps in the wire as false weak points marked with subtle terrain cues that German reconnaissance spotted and reported back as sector exploitable. But when panzers funneled through, they hit kill zones of pre-registered artillery and interlocking machine gun fire from strong points on both flanks, because the gap was bait. The third layer consisted of mutually supporting strongpoints using Italian concrete posts that were now reinforced, each holding a platoon of 30 men with 2 Vickers machine guns, a 3-inch mortar, anti-tank rifles and grenades, positioned so every strongpoint could support its neighbours with enfilade fire. If the enemy penetrated strongpoint R7, then R6 and R9 could rake them from both sides, because no strongpoint fought alone. Morshead's standing order to every platoon commander was unambiguous. If the enemy breaks through your wire, the immediate counterattack is automatic. Do not wait for orders. Do not wait for support. Counterattack now. The fourth layer comprised mobile reserves positioned centrally, Australian infantry companies and British Matilda tanks that were slow and obsolete but immune to most German anti-tank guns, so that any penetration deeper than the strong point line triggered a reserve response within 30 minutes. Every company rehearsed this 3 times a week through night compass marches, live fire coordination with artillery, and timed assaults with tank support, because Morshead didn't hope the system worked. He drilled it until failure was mechanically impossible. This wasn't an Australian-only defence, as the Polish Carpathian Brigade, veterans who had escaped Poland via Romania and were desperate to fight Germans anywhere, held the critical western sector and would prove ferocious. New Zealand artillery detachments provided fire support that was precise and devastating. Indian 18th Cavalry patrols screened the southern perimeter, and British sappers maintained minefields under fire while repairing wire at night and planting fresh mines in daylight craters. Morshead commanded, but he didn't fight alone. On April 11, 1941, Rommel probed the perimeter with light reconnaissance to test reactions, and Tobruk fired back with disciplined accuracy that prompted Rommel to note, "The garrison is alert." April 13th and 14th brought the first major assault when Rommel committed the 5th Light Division against the southern perimeter near post R7, where Stukas plastered the strongpoints at dawn as German artillery pounded the wire and panzers advanced at 0800 hours. The outpost line withdrew as planned while panzers rolled through and hit the weak gap Morshead had left. Perfectly marked and perfectly mined. 3 tanks were immobilised immediately as Australian 25-pounder field guns and British artillery opened up from hidden positions using pre-registered coordinates they'd rehearsed for 3 days, with shells bracketing the armour while German infantry dismounted to clear wire under fire as machine guns from R6 and R9 enfiladed from both flanks and the attack stalled. At 1400 hours, the 2nd 17th Battalion, 60 men and 1 captain, launched a local counterattack without orders from above, executing it automatically as drilled, retaking the gap in 18 minutes. Rommel called off the attack at dusk, having suffered over 200 casualties and 5 panzers destroyed or disabled for 0 gain. First repulse. April 16th and 17th saw the Easter battle when Rommel escalated with full commitment of the 5th Light Division, elements of the Brescia division with Italian infantry, massed artillery, and continuous Stuka support against the western perimeter at posts S7 through S11, which were held by the Polish Carpathian Brigade. Dawn on April 16th brought German guns saturating the Polish positions for 2 hours of bombardment that saw strongpoint S8 take a direct hit with half the position collapsing as panzers advanced through smoke and dust, and by 1000 hours, German infantry occupied S8 in what appeared to be a real breach. But Morshead's system engaged as the 2nd 48th Australian Battalion deployed northeast of the breach, while Polish units on the flanks held and refused to retreat. And British Matilda tanks ground forward, slow but unstoppable against German 37mm anti-tank guns. At 1600 hours, the Matildas reached S8 with Australian infantry following to clear bunkers with grenades and bayonets, retaking S8 by nightfall, while April 17th saw German probing attacks continue, but all were repulsed. German casualties over 2 days reached 1,200 men and 17 tanks against Tobruk, casualties of 240 killed and wounded, prompting Rommel to write in his diary, "Tobruk's defences are tougher than expected. The Australians fight with extraordinary stubbornness." April 30th through May 4th brought Rommel's final attempt to crack Tobruk by frontal assault when the 15th Panzer Division, newly arrived at full strength, attacked the southwestern perimeter at dawn, and this time they broke through. German armour and infantry penetrated 2 kilometres inside the wire to create a salient that Rommel poured reinforcements into for 72 hours while the perimeter remained breached. But Morshead watched without panicking. He isolated the salient with artillery through continuous harassment fire on supply routes to deny resupply, while organising a deliberate reduction rather than a desperate counterattack. And at 0400 hours on May 3rd, the 2nd 23rd and 2nd 24th Battalions, supported by Matilda tanks and concentrated mortar fire, attacked the salient from 3 sides. Rommel called off offensive operations because Tobruk had broken his tempo, as the blitzkrieg pattern of speed, shock and collapse didn't work here. None of this held without supply, as Tobruk's harbour came under daily attack from Stuka raids at dawn and dusk, plus long-range Italian artillery. But Royal Navy destroyers and fast mine layers ran convoys at night with blackout unloading, while Australian and British dock crews moved ammunition, water, rations and medical supplies from ship to perimeter in under 6 hours. One night, a Stuka strike hit a fuel dump, creating a fire visible across the desert, but unloading continued regardless. The siege became attrition, and Morshead was better at attrition than Rommel. May 1941 saw Rommel settle into siege mode with encirclement, bombardment and waiting for Tobruk to starve or crack. But Morshead refused the script. His doctrine was clear: the garrison will dominate no man's land. Translation: aggressive patrolling every single night. 12 to 20 men led by officers or senior NCOs used silent approach with no talking, compass navigation, faces blackened and equipment taped to eliminate noise as they targeted German observation posts, artillery positions, supply dumps and prisoners for intelligence. On May 24th, the 2nd 13th Battalion conducted a textbook raid when a patrol slipped through the wire at midnight, infiltrated a German forward position, captured 4 soldiers without firing a shot, and extracted by 0300 hours. The prisoners talked, revealing unit dispositions, morale problems and supply shortages that showed Axis forces were exhausted. June 17th saw Australian sappers demolish a German 88mm flak emplacement with satchel charges, while the gun crew never heard them coming. And on July 22nd, a combined Australian-British patrol destroyed an Axis ammunition stockpile, whose secondary explosions lit up the night, with German war diaries recording heavy losses, morale effect significant. Australian and British gunners memorised enemy positions including assembly areas, suspected bivouacs and approach routes for random night bombardments of 30 shells followed by silence, then 2 hours later 60 shells at a different target, so the Germans couldn't sleep, couldn't predict and couldn't rest. New Zealand artillery crews specialised in counter-battery work to silence German guns that ranged the harbour through precision fire using sound ranging and observation. And by August, the toll was documented in German war diaries. The Australians raid nightly, our forward troops cannot rest, morale is suffering, requests for relief increasing. Rommel couldn't maintain offensive tempo when his forward units were degraded every 72 hours, turning the siege into a drain not on Tobruk, but on the Afrika Korps. Tobruk held because of three factors. First, doctrine matched terrain, because defence in depth wasn't new, but Morshead tailored it perfectly to desert conditions where sparse terrain meant strong points had to support each other rather than stand alone. Minefields channeled attackers into kill zones rather than blocking them outright, and reserves counter-attacked immediately rather than after committee deliberation. Every layer served a purpose, every tactic was rehearsed until automatic, and there was no improvisation under fire because the fire had already been planned for. Second, command climate mattered because Morshead's no-retreat order wasn't bravado but clarity, as every man knew the mission. Hold the line, engage the enemy, survive until relief, with no evacuation fantasy, no false hope, just the work. That clarity eliminated doubt, so soldiers didn't waste mental energy wondering if they'd be evacuated, but instead focused on the trench, the wire, the gun, which meant discipline became reflex, counterattacks became automatic, and standards, obsessive, unforgiving standards, kept soldiers alive. Third, Allied integration proved essential because this was a Commonwealth defence, where Morshead commanded but Poles held the West with unbreakable resolve. New Zealanders delivered artillery that German gunners learned to fear. Indians patrolled the southern desert with skill honed in frontier wars, and British sappers and tankers anchored the mobile reserve. No single nation won Tobruk, they won it together. October 1941 brought Operation Crusader, the British offensive to relieve Tobruk, and by December the siege was lifted after 241 days. Rommel's offensive into Egypt was delayed by 8 months as his supply line became overstretched and his divisions were worn down by relentless night raids and static siege warfare, because Tobruk didn't win the North African campaign, but it bought time, bled momentum, and anchored the line when everything else collapsed. The cost was 832 Australians killed and over 2,000 wounded, with Polish, British, Indian and New Zealand casualties bringing the total to over 3,000, while Rommel's losses were estimated at 3,000 to 4,000 casualties in direct assaults, plus unknown attrition from raids and harassment. The legend of the Rats of Tobruk was coined by German propaganda through Lord Haw-Haw's radio broadcasts mocking the rats trapped in their hole. But the Australians adopted it with pride because rats survive and rats bite back. Morshead was knighted in 1942, commanded the 9th Division through El Alamein, returned to Australia in 1943, and died in 1959, largely forgotten outside military circles. But Tobruk remembers the schoolmaster-general who turned certainty of defeat into doctrine and proved that discipline, clarity, and relentless fieldcraft could stop even the desert fox. Now, a final question for you. What mattered more at Tobruk? The trenches and drills that made defence automatic, or the daring night raids that broke Rommel's tempo? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you liked this story and would like to see more history brought to life, then don't forget to like and subscribe. Until next time.